The desert night was cold, and the wind carried fine dust across the open plain. The man had pitched his tent near a line of dry bushes, hoping they would block some of the breeze. A small fire burned outside, glowing faintly against the endless darkness. He had traveled far that day, and his body was tired. Inside the tent, he stretched his legs, wrapped a blanket around himself, and tried to rest. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional cry of a night bird or the rustle of desert grass. As he closed his eyes, he thought the night would pass quietly. But soon he heard a sound. At first it was faint, like the dragging of tired feet over the sand. He opened his eyes, alert. His hand moved slowly toward the lantern near his blanket. The fire outside still burned low, but he could sense movement just beyond the circle of light. His heart beat faster. In this land, a man alone had to be careful. Travelers could be robbed, soldiers could stumble across his camp, or wild animals could draw near. He sat still, listening. The sound came again. This time it was closer, deliberate but hesitant. Then a figure appeared at the edge of the tent. A girl, young and thin, stood just beyond the flap. Her hair was long and tangled, falling over her shoulders, and her clothes were worn. Even in the dim firelight, he could see her face carried the marks of hunger and exhaustion. Her eyes, though sharp, showed weariness. She looked like she had walked for miles without food or water. The man did not move right away. He simply watched her. He knew at once she was Apache. Her features, her clothing, the way she carried herself, it was clear. He had seen Apache before, though never this close, never alone, and never in his tent. He felt a rush of questions. Why was she here? Where was her family, her people? Was this a trick? Were others hiding nearby, waiting for him to lower his guard? His hand remained on the lantern, though he did not light it yet. The girl did not speak. She only looked at him with steady eyes, then glanced inside the tent. Slowly, she placed one hand on the flap as if asking for permission to enter. He hesitated, but then he nodded once. She stepped in, quiet as a shadow, and sat down near the corner. Inside the tent, the air was warmer. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. He noticed how thin she was, how her lips were dry. Without words, her condition told a story of hardship. The man felt a wave of sympathy. He reached for his pack, pulled out some dry bread and a piece of dried meat, and held it out to her. At first she did not move, as though unsure whether to trust him. Then hunger won. She reached forward quickly, her fingers trembling as she took the food. She ate fast, chewing hard, swallowing as though each bite was painful but necessary. He watched quietly, saying nothing. Her silence spoke louder than words. When she finished the bread and meat, he poured a little water from his flask into a tin cup and passed it to her. She drank carefully at first, then tilted the cup higher until every drop was gone. A faint sigh escaped her lips, the sound of someone who had been thirsty for too long. For a moment, they simply sat in the dim space. The fire outside flickered, casting shifting shadows on the canvas walls. He wondered who she was running from or running to. His mind tried to imagine the path that had led her here. Perhaps her group had been scattered by soldiers, or maybe she had wandered off in search of food. Perhaps she had lost her way. The girl shifted slightly and pointed toward her chest, then to the horizon outside. She tried to form a word, but it came out broken, half swallowed by tiredness. Still, he understood enough. She was alone, far from her people. The desert was unforgiving, and she had needed shelter. Somehow she had chosen his tent. The man felt a mix of unease and responsibility. He had not planned to share his camp, let alone with an Apache girl. Yet he could not turn her away, not in her state. Outside, the wind howled against the tent, reminding him of the cold. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders tighter, and for the first time her eyes softened. Gratitude was clear there, even without words. He leaned back, watching her. She did not close her eyes. She sat upright, alert despite her fatigue, as though ready to run if danger appeared. He realized she was not only tired and hungry, she was afraid. Something, somewhere, had driven her to this desperate act. As the night deepened, silence returned. He closed his eyes again, though not fully asleep. Every so often he opened them and found her gaze still fixed on him, measuring him, deciding whether he was friend or foe. Each time their eyes met, she did not look away. There was strength in her, even in weakness. She was determined to survive. At one point, she reached down to the ground and picked up a small stone from near the tent flap. She rubbed it in her palm, almost like a habit, then traced a line in the sand beside her. The man watched, puzzled, but did not interrupt. She drew simple marks, lines, curves, shapes. He could not read their meaning, but he sensed they were not random. Perhaps they were signs from her people, or perhaps they were only for herself a way to remember. The fire outside dimmed, and the desert grew colder. He pulled another blanket from his pack and set it near her. She hesitated, but then wrapped it around her thin shoulders. For the first time, her breathing slowed and her body leaned slightly against the tent wall. She was drifting toward rest, though her hand still clutched the stone tightly. The man lay back, staring at the tent ceiling. Questions still circled in his mind. Was she lost forever, or would someone come looking for her? What would happen in the morning? And why had she chosen his tent? Out of all the places in the vast desert, as he finally closed his eyes, he felt the weight of the night pressing down. He did not know that this simple act, letting her in, giving her food, offering a blanket, would tie him to her in ways he could not yet imagine. The desert wind sighed again, carrying secrets across the sand. Inside the tent, two strangers from different worlds shared the same fragile shelter, bound by chance and the quiet strength of survival. The first light of dawn had not yet touched the horizon when the man stirred inside the tent. The fire outside had burned down to ash and the desert was colder than before. He turned slightly and noticed the girl sitting upright. She had not slept through the night. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, calm yet sharp, as though she had been watching every movement he made. For a moment he wondered how long she had been awake like that. Silent and alert, her fingers still curled around the small stone she had carried in. She shifted slowly and reached for the cup he had given her the night before. It was empty, but she held it in her hands as if trying to remember the water that had once filled it. Her lips moved as though she was whispering to herself, but no sound came. When she looked up again, their eyes met, and he realized something had changed between them during the night. She no longer looked like a stranger invading his space. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in her gaze. He sat up, brushing dust from his clothes, and pulled another piece of bread from his pack. Without a word, he handed it to her. She accepted it quickly, her thin hands trembling as she tore it apart. She ate with less urgency than before, but still like someone who did not know when the next meal would come. As she chewed, she studied him carefully, as though trying to decide if she could trust him further. The man broke his silence. His voice was low, calm. "Where are your people?" he asked slowly, not sure if she would understand. She tilted her head, hearing the words, but her reply came in broken fragments. She tapped her chest, then pointed toward the distant mountains. A few words slipped out, quiet and rough. He could not understand all of them, but the meaning was clear enough. Her people were far away. She was alone. For a moment, the weight of that truth settled heavily in the tent. She was no more than a girl, yet she had been wandering the desert on her own. He wondered what had happened. Had her family been forced to move? Had she become separated during a raid or a flight from soldiers? The silence that followed made him realize he might never know the full story. Still, the exhaustion on her face told him enough. She had endured more than most. She reached again for the stone she had held all night. Carefully, she placed it between them on the ground. Then, with her fingertips, she began to trace patterns around it in the thin layer of sand inside the tent. The lines formed shapes, circles, arrows, waves. The man leaned forward, watching closely. He did not recognize the symbols, but he could see they meant something to her. She glanced at him, then tapped the stone, then pointed at herself. After a pause, she tapped the sand between them, then pointed at him. He frowned, trying to piece it together. Slowly, he said, "You, me." He touched his chest, then hers. She nodded firmly. She tapped the stone again, pressing it deeper into the sand as if sealing some invisible promise. The man felt a strange shiver. He was not sure what she was trying to tell him, but the act felt important. It was more than a game or a habit. It was deliberate, perhaps even ceremonial. He thought of the way she had watched him all night, the way she had marked the ground with symbols, the way she had refused to sleep. There was purpose in every gesture. Outside, the desert sky began to change. A faint ribbon of pale light touched the eastern horizon, coloring the world in soft gray. The man rose and stepped out of the tent for a moment, pulling his coat tighter around him. He scanned the empty land, wary of anyone who might have followed her. But the plains stretched endlessly, broken only by distant hills and the scattered remains of old shrubs. There was no one in sight. When he turned back, she was standing at the flap holding the blanket he had given her. She stepped out slowly, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. She lifted her face toward the rising sun, closing her eyes as if drawing strength from its warmth. For a brief moment she looked less like a lost child and more like a figure carved from the desert itself, strong, silent, and unyielding. He joined her at the fire pit, where only a few glowing embers remained. He dropped dry twigs onto the ash and coaxed the flames back to life. She crouched beside him, her hands extended toward the warmth. Together they sat in silence, watching the fire grow. The air smelled of smoke and dust, and the new day began to stretch its arms across the sky. When she finally spoke, her voice was clearer than before. She used short words, gestures to fill the gaps. "You, safe," she said, pointing at him. Then she touched the stone again, which she had brought outside. She drew another symbol in the sand near the fire, then tapped it twice. The man realized she was marking him with something, some sign of belonging, of connection. To her the act seemed serious, even binding. He felt the weight of her actions, though he did not fully understand their meaning. Still, he sensed that whatever she had done in the tent, whatever mark she had made with stone and sand, it was not something she considered temporary. As the morning grew brighter, he packed his things, rolling his blanket and securing his supplies. He expected her to leave then, to vanish into the desert the way she had come. Instead, she stayed close, watching his every movement. When he lifted his bag, she reached for the strap as if to carry it with him. He shook his head, taking it back gently, but she still followed as he stepped away from the tent. He paused, uneasy. He had not planned for company. The journey ahead was not easy, and he was uncertain what danger she might bring. Yet something in her eyes told him she had already chosen her path. In her mind, she had tied her fate to his. He remembered the marks in the sand, the stone pressed into the ground, the way she had tapped the symbol again and again. She had claimed him in her own way. He sighed, running a hand over his face, and looked at her once more. Her expression was firm, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. Though thin and weary, she did not waver. She was ready to follow him wherever he went. In that moment, he understood. The night had not simply been about food and shelter. It had been a crossing of paths, a decision made not by chance but by will. She had entered his tent as a desperate girl, hungry and tired, but by morning she had declared something greater, that he was no longer alone and neither was she. The desert stretched wide before them, its vast silence broken only by the cry of a distant hawk. The man tightened the strap on his bag and began to walk. Beside him, the girl stepped forward, steady and sure, as though she had walked that path her whole life. And though he did not yet understand what the mark truly meant, he carried it with him, unseen but powerful, like a secret etched into the very sand beneath their feet. The sun had already climbed high when the man realized the girl had no intention of leaving his side. Each step he took, she followed with quiet determination. Her bare feet moved swiftly over the rough ground as though the sharp stones and hot sand meant nothing to her. She carried nothing except the small stone she had marked the night before and the blanket he had given her. For hours they walked together, and though few words passed between them, the silence was filled with an invisible thread that bound them. When the heat grew stronger, they paused near a dry stream bed. The man lowered his bag and drank from his flask, then handed it to her. She accepted it without hesitation, her eyes never leaving his face. After a sip, she pressed her fingers to the cup's rim and traced the same small pattern she had drawn in the sand. It was a circle with a line through it, simple yet deliberate. Then she handed the flask back as if sealing it with the mark. He frowned slightly, unsure of its meaning. Yet there was something undeniable about the way she did it. She was claiming more than water or food, she was claiming him. The thought unsettled him, but it also stirred something deeper, something he could not name. Later that day, they reached a cluster of low hills where he planned to camp before crossing the open plain. As he set up a small fire, he noticed her watching every movement. When he cut strips of dried meat and laid them across a hot stone to warm, she crouched close, imitating his motions, as though she wanted to learn. When he offered her food, she accepted, but also pushed a small piece back toward him, a gesture that seemed like an offering. He ate it without question, sensing it mattered to her. The night came quickly, bringing with it a sharp chill. The stars spread wide across the black sky, brighter than lanterns, endless in their number. He sat by the fire, pulling his blanket close, and she sat across from him. For a long time she said nothing, but her eyes were steady on him, Then with slow movements she reached for the stone again. She pressed it into the ash by the fire, lifted it, and touched it gently against his arm. The man stiffened. A faint trace of black smudge remained on his skin where the stone had touched. She looked at it, then nodded firmly as if satisfied. He rubbed the mark with his fingers, but she shook her head quickly, raising her hand to stop him. "No," she whispered, her voice low but clear. Then she touched her chest and tapped the stone again. He understood then. The mark was hers, and now it was his. It was not something to be wiped away. To her it meant connection. She had chosen him in her way as someone she trusted, perhaps even more. The weight of that realization made him uneasy. What did it mean in her world? Was it a bond of protection, a promise, or a claim of belonging? He had heard stories before of tribal marks, of symbols that carried deep meaning. But he had never expected one to be placed on him. He looked at the faint line on his arm and felt both uncertain and strangely honored. By morning, the mark was still there, faint but visible in the soft light. He rolled up his blanket and prepared to move on, but when he looked at her, he saw she was waiting for him to acknowledge it. He touched his arm lightly, then nodded once, and her eyes brightened. She stood quickly, ready to follow. As they traveled that day, they passed near a small settlement where traders and travelers often stopped. The man needed supplies, so he led her toward it. But the moment they entered the edge of the camp, curious eyes turned toward them. People paused from their work, whispering to one another. Some pointed at the girl, others at him. A few frowned, their faces hard with suspicion. The man felt the tension in the air. He knew how settlers often looked at the Apache, with fear, mistrust, even hatred. He walked steadily, but he sensed the girl stiffen beside him. Her eyes darted around, her body tense as though ready to run. At one stall, an older trader noticed the faint black mark still visible on the man's arm. His eyes widened slightly. He looked at the girl, then back at the man. For a moment he said nothing. Then lowering his voice, he muttered, "She marked you." The man froze. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. The trader shook his head. "That's no small thing. To them it's a bond. You're tied now, whether you understand it or not. She marked you as hers." His tone was neither mocking nor kind, only matter-of-fact. The words lingered in the man's ears as he collected the supplies he needed. When he turned back, the girl was standing close, watching every stranger with sharp eyes, but her hand brushed lightly against his sleeve, as if to remind him she was there. They left the settlement quickly, moving back into the open desert. The man's thoughts churned as they walked. He replayed the trader's words again and again, marked, tied, hers. He looked at the girl, walking barefoot beside him, her hair blowing with the wind. She did not speak, but her steady presence told him everything he needed to know. That night, as they camped near a rocky ridge, he sat by the fire, turning the stone she had left near his pack. He weighed it in his hand, feeling its smooth surface, the faint black ash still clinging to it. She sat across from him, silent but watchful. After a long time, she leaned forward and touched the stone again, then pointed to the sky. The stars glimmered above them, endless and bright. She traced another symbol in the sand, a circle with two lines crossing. She pointed at it, then at him. Then she pointed at herself. Finally, she touched the stone again and closed her hand around it, holding it tightly against her chest. The man's breath slowed. He understood now, at least partly. The mark was not just a sign of ownership or claim. It was a bond of loyalty, of connection that went beyond words. She had chosen him not by accident, but by a decision she had made with all her strength. For the first time, he did not feel uneasy about it. Instead, he felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This girl had trusted him with her survival, her fate, perhaps even more. And in return, he could not simply turn away. As the fire crackled and the desert night wrapped around them, he looked at her and nodded slowly. The faintest smile touched her lips, small but real. Before she lowered her eyes to the fire again, the mark remained on his arm, no longer just a smudge of ash. To him it had become something more, a reminder that in this vast, harsh land, two strangers had crossed paths and found a bond that neither of them had expected, but both now carried with unspoken acceptance. The desert tested every traveler who dared to cross it. By the fourth day together, the man realized how much the girl's presence had changed the way he moved through the land. She walked with confidence even without shoes. her eyes scanning the horizon as if she belonged to the earth itself. Where he saw only sand and rock, she saw signs of life, tiny tracks, plants hidden under stones, water hidden in unlikely places. That morning, she led him to a cluster of cactus and broke off a thick stem with practiced hands. She peeled away the skin and handed him the wet inside. He chewed it slowly, surprised by the cool moisture it carried. Without her, he might have passed it by, never knowing. For the first time, he understood that her bond with him was not a burden, but a gift. She was not only surviving, she was helping him survive too. Yet the bond brought new dangers. As the sun set one evening, the man spotted a thin trail of smoke in the distance. His first thought was that other travelers had made camp, but the girl's sharp intake of breath told him otherwise. Her eyes narrowed and she pulled at his arm, shaking her head. She whispered a word he did not know, but the fear in her voice was enough. Whoever made that fire was not a friend. They moved quietly along the ridge until night fell completely. The man kept the fire low, hardly more than a glow between stones. The girl sat close, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. She seemed to hear sounds he could not, tilting her head slightly, straining to catch even the faintest noise. After a while, she pointed toward the south and whispered again. He understood others were near. The man reached instinctively for the rifle he carried. He had kept it slung across his back all this time, untouched, but now the weight of it felt heavy in his hands. The girl shook her head, pressing his arm down. She pointed at the ground, then at the sky, as if reminding him that loud sounds carried far. Her way was silence, not bullets. That night neither of them slept. The man sat with his back against the rocks, watching the fire fade while the girl crouched beside him, alert as a wild creature. When dawn finally broke, they moved quickly, leaving no trace of their camp behind. The bond between them felt sharper now, not just one of trust, but of shared danger. Later that day, as they descended into a dry valley, the man noticed 3 riders far in the distance. Their silhouettes were small against the horizon, but the dust trailing behind them was unmistakable. He knew enough to realize they were following. Whether they were settlers, soldiers, or raiders, he could not tell. But the girl tensed, her shoulders tightening, her steps quickening. By evening, they reached a narrow canyon where red stone walls rose high on both sides. The girl led him into a crevice hidden by brush, motioning for silence. They slipped inside and crouched in the shadows. Moments later, the sound of hooves echoed faintly through the canyon. The riders passed above, unaware of the 2 figures hidden below. The girl's hand gripped the man's sleeve tightly until the sound faded away. Only then did she release him, her breath coming out slow and shaky. The man looked at her, realizing the truth. If he had been alone, he might have walked straight into danger. But she had guided him away, protected him with her knowledge of the land. She was no burden. She was his shield as much as he was hers. That night, when they camped again, the girl brought out the stone once more. She pressed it against her forehead, then against his hand. She drew another mark on the sand near the fire, this one larger, with more lines crossing the circle. When she was done, she touched her chest, then pointed at him. Her voice was quiet but steady. Together, the word hung in the air. It was simple, but it carried weight. He nodded slowly. Together, he repeated. The next morning, they left the canyon behind, but the riders returned. This time, the man saw them clearly. Settlers, armed with rifles, their faces stern and hard. They rode closer, cutting across the plain to block the path. The girl froze, her body tense. The man felt his stomach tighten. He knew what this would look like to them. A white traveler walking with an Apache girl. To them, it would mean trouble. The riders dismounted, spreading out. One of them called out harshly, demanding to know what the girl was doing with him. The man stood his ground, his hand resting near his rifle but not raising it. He answered calmly, saying she was with him, that she meant no harm. The men laughed bitterly. One of them sneered, pointing at the girl. She marked you, didn't she? Look at your arm. You're tied to her now. His words were laced with mockery but also fear. He spat on the ground and shook his head. Foolish. You don't know what you've done. The girl moved closer to the man, her eyes blazing with defiance. She stood tall, though small and thin, her chin lifted proudly. The mark on his arm, faint but still visible, seemed to glow brighter in that tense moment. It was not just a smudge of ash anymore, it was a symbol, one the riders recognized and feared. The standoff stretched long. The men whispered among themselves, uneasy. Finally, the leader muttered something under his breath and waved his hand. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving behind only the dust of their passing. The man exhaled slowly, tension draining from his body. He looked at the girl. She had not moved, her eyes still sharp, her hand gripping his sleeve tightly. When the riders disappeared over the ridge, she finally let go. But not before pressing her palm against his arm, directly over the mark she had made. That night, by the fire, he thought about what had happened. Outsiders had seen the mark and reacted with fear, not ridicule. The trader's words returned to him. "You're tied now." The girl had claimed him, but in doing so, she had also given him protection, even against men who might have otherwise turned on him. As the fire burned low, the man realized something he had not admitted before. He no longer thought of her as a stranger. She was his companion, his guide, his bond in this unforgiving land. She had marked him, but he had accepted the mark. Together, they would face whatever the desert placed in their path. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, silent witnesses to the fragile but powerful connection between them. Two souls, bound by choice and chance, walking side by side in a world that often sought to divide them. The man knew now that he would not leave her behind. He was no longer alone, and neither was she. The morning broke quiet and clear, the kind of silence that felt heavy with meaning. The man packed his blanket and supplies with steady hands, but his mind was restless. He knew the desert had many tests, but what unsettled him now was not the land. It was the weight of the invisible bond that had grown between him and the Apache girl. She had marked him, not with words but with action, and that mark had already carried power in the eyes of others. He could no longer pretend it was just a smudge of ash. It had changed how people saw him. More importantly, it had changed how he saw himself. The girl walked beside him as they left the camp, her steps light but purposeful. She no longer trailed a few paces behind as she had in the beginning. Now she walked close, sometimes brushing his sleeve with her hand as though reminding him she was there. She carried nothing except the small stone, but it seemed to carry the weight of her entire world. As the sun rose higher, they reached a valley where the land opened into wide grass plains. From the ridge, the man could see smoke rising in the far distance, not from riders or traders, but from a larger camp. The girl stopped suddenly, her eyes fixed on the faint plumes. Her body tensed and her breath caught in her throat. He saw her lips move, forming words he could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Prayer or maybe hope. She turned to him, her eyes bright with something new. Then she pointed toward the smoke and pressed her hand firmly against his marked arm. Her meaning was clear. Those were her people. The mark she had given him was not just between them. It was meant to lead him here. The man felt his chest tighten. He had known this moment would come. She was not meant to wander the desert alone forever, nor to live only by his side. She belonged to her people, and now they were close. But what did that mean for him? Would they welcome him, or would they see him as an intruder? The mark might protect him, or it might place him in even greater danger. They walked for hours until the camp came into view. Dozens of shelters stood among the grass, smoke rising from small fires. Children played near the edge, their laughter carrying faintly on the breeze. Women tended to food, men sharpened tools and bows. The girl stopped again, her eyes filled with tears she did not let fall. For a long moment she simply stood there, taking in the sight. Then gathering her courage, she walked forward, her head held high. The man followed, each step heavy with uncertainty. As they drew near, the camp noticed them. Conversation stilled, heads turned, and soon all eyes were fixed on the pair. The man felt the weight of their stares, sharp and questioning. He expected anger, suspicion, maybe even hostility. But when the girl stepped into the camp and raised the stone high, everything changed. Voices rose in surprise. A group of elders came forward, their faces lined with years of wisdom. They looked at the girl, then at the man, then at the faint mark still on his arm. One of them spoke in their language, the words flowing quickly. The girl answered, her voice strong, her hand never leaving the man's sleeve. The elder's eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. The man did not know the words exchanged, but he felt the meaning. The girl was declaring what had happened in the desert, that she had chosen him, marked him, and bound their paths together. Among her people, it was not something to take lightly. Some of the camp's men frowned, uneasy, but none moved against him. Instead, the elders nodded, their gazes lingering on the girl with pride. She had survived hunger and loneliness. She had found shelter and forged a bond stronger than chance. The mark had power not only between them but within her people as well. That night they were given food and a place near the central fire. The man sat quietly watching as the girl reunited with her people. She laughed softly for the first time since he had met her, her face lighting with relief. Yet even as she spoke with them, her eyes returned to him again and again, making sure he was still there. Each time their gazes met, she touched her chest lightly, then pointed at him. A silent reminder of the bond. He realized then that she had not brought him here to leave him behind. She had brought him here because in her heart, he was already a part of her world. The mark had not been a request, it had been a declaration. In the days that followed, the man learned more about the meaning of what she had done. Through gestures, broken words, and the translation of those who spoke some English, he understood. When she had marked him with the stone and ash, she had not only claimed him as her protector, but also offered him her loyalty. It was a bond of trust, stronger than spoken promises. To her people it meant unity, 2 lives tied together, neither abandoned. At first he wrestled with the weight of it. He had not chosen it in the way she had, not with intention. But as he thought back on their journey, the night she entered his tent, the way she had shared food and silence, the way she had guided him from danger, he realized he had accepted it long before he understood it. His actions had already answered her gesture. One evening, as the fire painted the sky in orange and smoke rose into the darkening air, he sat beside her while the camp gathered. The girl held the stone in her hand and placed it carefully between them. She drew the same symbol in the sand that she had drawn the night she first stayed in his tent. The circle, the lines crossing, the mark of bond. This time she guided his hand to trace it with her. The camp watched in silence. When they were done, the elders nodded once more as though sealing what had already been written in the desert itself. The bond was real, recognized and unbroken. The man looked at the girl, and for the first time he did not feel confusion or unease. He felt peace. She had marked him, yes, but not out of possession. She had marked him because she had chosen him as part of her story, just as he had unknowingly chosen her as part of his. From that day on, he carried the mark not only on his arm, but in his heart. It was no longer just a symbol made with ash. It was a reminder of survival, trust, and a bond formed in the silence of the desert night. The desert winds still blew, harsh and unforgiving, but he no longer feared them, for he knew now that he was not alone. Wherever the path led, across plains, through mountains, into the unknown, the mark would remain. A quiet, powerful truth whispered between 2 souls from different worlds. They were bound not by chance but by choice. And in that truth, the man finally understood what the girl had known all along. By morning, when she marked him as hers, she had not taken something from him. She had given him something instead, a bond that would change his life forever.